Join us as we do a deep dive into the history of the James Gang with Richard Shack, the guitarist who replaced Tommy Bolin after Tommy quit the James Gang to pursue his solo career in 1974. We go in depth into Richard's personal musical history from childhood forward, and we see the whole history of the James Gang through his eyes. Plus, we explore a variety of famous music industry luminaries as we do the deep dive oral history with Richard Shack, formerly of the James Gang. If it's Friday, February the 3rd, 2023, it must be the time for me to speak with somebody I'm very excited to have a chat with in relation to the history of Tommy Bolin, and that's Richard Shack, who has a unique seat in terms of the history of the James Gang. And we're going to dig into all of that, how Richard got involved with music, how he and Jim Fox became friends, how they were competing, and then eventually how Richard replaced Tommy Bolin in the James Gang. So, Richard, thrilled that you're here.
Glad to be here.
So, let's go right back to the beginning. What are your earliest memories of being aware of music on TV, on the radio, and when you started going, hey, there's something that I'm drawn to there?
Well, I always listened to the radio as a kid, and my brother, I had a brother who was 9 years older than me. So he was listening to doo-wop and stuff like that. And I would listen to the radio late at night in my bedroom. And I was always into music. And I like blues and rock and jazz and bluegrass, everything. I just always loved music. And then I played trumpet for a very little while. And then I got a guitar, and it was a little bit of folk music. You know, Tom Paxton, Tom Paisley, Buffy St. Marie, all that stuff. But as soon as the British invasion happened, I dropped it like a hot potato. And I immediately wanted to get an electric guitar. And I went to Sears and bought a Silvertone amp. And I got an electric guitar, and I said goodbye to folk music for a while.
What was that first guitar? Was it also a Sears, or what was it?
My first electric guitar was actually an acoustic guitar with a DeArmond pickup in the hole, which a lot of guys still kind of do that now. And but it didn't look cool. You know, I needed something that looked like an electric guitar, a block of wood with a couple of pickups on it.
Isn't that actually a big part of the equation?
It is.
It's got to look cool.
It's part of the vibe. You know, it's funny, even where you wear your guitar, like you notice jazz guitarists, usually they're sitting, and because they're playing very fluid and fast, the guitar is up high on their chest. Then the blues guys are more like Clapton, where it's down around your belly button and you're playing. And then if you're Jimmy Page or Bo Diddley, you got it almost down to your knees. Pete Townshend, so when you swing your arm, you can do the bird and you can do big chords. So where you wear your guitar, I've always had a theory, affects kind of how you play.
I want to attach some dates to this. Do you have an awareness of the first 45 or album that you ever bought and how old you were?
Yeah, first 45 I can remember buying was Little Star. Where are you, little star, was the line in the song. And I think it might have been the Elegance. And it kind of had a little bit of the it was all about harmony then. And my mother worked at the May Company, and I went up to their little record place they had up there, and I'd heard Little Star on the radio, and I had to have that record. And then I got Get a Job was another record I bought right early on.
How old?
I would say 1960.
And you were how old then?
13.
13.
I didn't drive yet, right?
And then do you remember the first album, which would have been quite the graduation to go from 45s to
Yeah,
LP?
album. I really don't remember the first album I bought. For some reason, I just, it was always 45s when I was young.
Yep.
And then when I graduated high school, things became, I remember buying the Mothers of Invention album. Obviously, I bought the Beatle albums as they came out, the Rolling Stone albums, and then all the English, the Yardbirds, the Kinks, the Pretty Things, on and on. I was all about the English. And there was a few American bands, the Beau Brummels, the Byrds. That's getting up, moving a couple of years up already, but love the English thing.
So how old would you have been when you got that first guitar, the acoustic guitar with the pickups?
I was about 15.
15. And what was the vibe with your parents? Were they, as you got more invested and engaged and passionate with music, were they supportive or
My
were they skeptical?
my dad was always supportive right from the get-go. My mother was always skeptical right from the get-go. She used to say to me when I was playing in a rock band, all your friends, one guy's a dentist, another guy owns a carpet barn, and you're out playing with a bunch of hippies.
And how did your father's support manifest?
He would say to my mother, "Let the kid do what he needs to do." I mean,
And
that
so
was the line.
did he help you buy instruments and amps and stuff?
Yes. As a matter of fact, we went and bought a Stella guitar for $18. That was my very first guitar, a Stella guitar, $18. And, I play a couple notes on it. And I got a Mel Bay chord book, which showed you how to play the chord on a drawing of the 6 strings, but it also had a little square picture of the guy's hands. And it's funny because I misread a couple of the pictures. And to this day, I play an open D and A kind of backwards from the way you're supposed to play it, but it's the way I did it because I just misread the picture somehow.
That makes you hip.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Richard's got his own way of doing this.
That's right.
Um, so your first band, when do you remember getting together with some buddies, or how did that come about that you would actually think you were in your first band?
Right. My first band was called the Scarlet, and we had no bass player. We had a drummer, 2 guitars, and a lead singer. And we played some parties, and you know how I used to set up in a garage facing the apron of the driveway, and they'd have a little party. And, we did that. And I remember playing in a bar called the King's Pub, and we're playing the song Satisfaction. And a grown-up comes in and picks up one of the floor toms of the drummer and walks out of the bar with it. He comes back in, turns out it was the drummer's father. And piece by piece, he took the kid's drums out of the bar. Then he took his son out of the bar.
This
And
was
that was
not
the
your
end of that,
this
right
was
in
not
front of
your
the audience.
this was not your father. He
Yeah.
wouldn't have done
No, not my father would have never done that.
that.
And I recently ran into that guy who's a doctor in LA, and I told him that story, which he remembered he had forgotten about. He's no longer a musician, but it was pretty funny. And the people are looking at us and like, well, as you can see, we have no drummer anymore.
So that, I guess, was the end of that band, or did you guys then just find another drummer?
That was the end of that band because then I went off to college, and we had the band called the Governors with Jim Fox.
So
And
let's back up then
okay,
to when you first met Jim.
Well, I first met Jim in like the 7th or 8th grade, and I knew he
And,
was a
wh- and
musician.
and where was this? Is this in Cleveland?
Yeah, in Cleveland, at Roosevelt Junior High School.
Wow.
And I met Jimmy, and I knew he was a musician. And he was way ahead. He had already been taking lessons, and doing his radamucus and paradiddles on the drums. And I was just learning chords. I was real basic. And we had a band called the Governors, and we played every weekend in Columbus, Ohio, on Ohio State campus. We played fraternity parties, basically.
Did you guys both go to Ohio State?
We both went to Ohio State the first year. Then Jimmy left and went to Kent the second year. Dale Peters at the time was a drummer. He came in and he replaced Jimmy Fox in the Governors as a drummer. That was 1965, that year through like September from college, 65 through June of 66. The Governors played in Columbus. Then we went down to Dayton and played a club called Little Mickey's, who was a midget that was a wrestling promoter that owned a club. And we played down there for the summer. Then in the September of 66, Jimmy did not come back to Ohio State. He went to Kent. I went back to Ohio State, and Dale Peters, who was a drummer, replaced Jimmy in the Governors. And we played that next year, or part of that next year, into 67 in the Governors. Then Dale moved back to Cleveland and called me and he said, "Do you want to start a band up in Cleveland?" That's when we formed D.T. Hooley. That point, I went and saw Jimmy Fox and the James Gang, and that's when Glenn Schwartz, you know about Glenn?
I know the name.
Okay, well, Glenn Schwartz was a legend in Cleveland, and he'd been in Europe in the Army. He was a great blues guitar player. He ended up playing in Pacific Gas and Electric. And but he sat in with the James Gang. They were playing a club called the Music Box. They had a guitar player named Mouse who had a pretty lousy sound on his guitar.
Mouse.
So
the James Gang exists. So was Mouse the first guitar player in the James Gang?
I believe so. I believe he was the first one. And then Glenn Schwartz showed up at this bar, and I'd heard of Glenn. He picked up the kid's guitar, same amp, and sounded like Jeff Beck. Okay. It was amazing. It was just, and that night I said to whoever I was with, I says, "I got to move back to Cleveland. I got to get together with this guy." And I started going to his mother's house every Saturday for my lessons in the blues.
Glenn.
And he was the man, and he became the James Gang's guitar player.
And so when did were you like in communication with Jim at this point, or was it kind of an arm's length?
Yeah, I mean, remember, no cell phones, saw each other whenever. I told him I liked his band, and then I came up and Dale and I formed D.T. Hooley.
D.T. Hooley?
E with an E. The case of E.T. Hooley. It was a Scotland Yard case. E like Edward.
E.T. Hooley.
Yeah. We were thinking of names. We looked through a book. Said Scotland Yard cases. Who knows why. We became the case of E.T. Hooley. And in Cleveland, they just called us either E.T. Hooley or Hooley. And played, I started to write. We played a couple songs I wrote, but mainly we played everything from Moby Grape to Cream to Hendrix, anything with electric guitar. It's anything, Yardbirds, anything that we were all about guitar.
So what was your gear by that point? What was your guitar? What was your amps? How were you getting your sound?
I had a Marshall amp, and I had a Gibson 345 TD, which was like what BB King. It had a Veritone switch. It's just like the regular 335s, except they called it a Gibson stereo. It was a great guitar, and it was stolen from under my bed while I slept in that bed in New York City.
Wow.
we put a guy up in our apartment. We had played down in St. Thomas, E.T. Hooley in Puerto Rico. And this guy stayed with us. And while we were asleep, Dale Peters and I slept in twin beds with a little lamp table in between. We both kept our guitars and his bass, his EB3, Gibson AB3 and he came in the middle of the night and stole our guitars. It was crushing. It was crushing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then how much would that guitar have cost back then?
That guitar I bought for something like $425 new from D Fiore's, and that was a good amount of money in 1966 or 67. That guitar now is worth 25 grand easy.
Yeah, 400 back then was probably, who knows what. I guess if you do the math, it's like 4,000 today's dollars.
Yeah, I know my parents were paying on. We had a big a two-family house we lived in. It was really big, and we paid $125 a month rent. So that could, it was 4 months rent or whatever for the, for a guitar like that. And then I got a Les Paul.
Oh, did you?
Mm-hmm.
Which one?
Just a standard Les Paul, which is what I play today. Not the same one. I have a gold top now that I play.
Was it black? Was it black?
It was red. It was red.
Red.
It probably wasn't factory red, but it was red. And I can send you a couple pictures I have of that guitar, and then I can send you a picture of the guitar, the gold top, that I bought while in the James Gang in Nashville, Tennessee, from a guy named George Gruen, who's a very famous guitar seller in Nashville. His place used to be called GTR. Now I think it's Gruen's Guitars, and he has guitars there for $50,000. I mean, guitars are off the hook,
And now that our generation has X% of our generation has maybe had some success, and people want to collect, and then you got to compete with Joe Bonamassa.
Exactly.
And he's gonna come in there and buy whatever he wants.
Right. And I ended up with an original Flying V. That guitar is worth $100,000. I sold it for $2,000. Obviously, I'm not a good businessman.
That must have been a few years back, I would assume.
Yeah. There's only about 200 made of the Carina Maple Flying V. I think I might have sent you a picture of me playing with one. I don't remember, but I will if I didn't. But and that's what I used in the James Gang, was a Flying V. And
so then let's go back to where Glenn then became the guitar player, obviously, in the James Gang.
Right.
And how long did that chapter last?
That lasted for a while. They were playing with Schwartz and a guy named Tom Chris on bass, Phil Giambardo on keyboard, and Jimmy Fox on drums.
And so they must have had some traction locally.
Oh, they were big. They were big locally. So was E.T. Hooley. We all played every weekend, and we had what we called teenage clubs. And I don't know if you had them out in Colorado, but there was no liquor. They had a high stage. So it wasn't like you were playing in a bar on a stage that's 6 inches high. They had a stage that was 3 foot high, and hundreds of kids would show up. And it was a gig from like maybe 8:30 till 11. And, I had one kid who came to all our gigs. I said, "You really must like us." I said, "Well, you have a Marshall amp. I want to see one."
Are you familiar with what then occurred how Jim met Joe to where then everything kind of shifted?
Yeah, what happened there was Glenn moved out to LA and kind of went through a whole religious thing and ended up in Pacific Gas and Electric. If you remember, they had a song called "Are You Ready?" And I was living in LA by that time. The E.T. Hooley moved to LA, and I was living in LA at that time when all that happened. And Walsh was in a band called the Measles.
At Kent State, right?
At Kent State. Jimmy was at Kent State, like I told you, for the second year. I don't know how they met. I don't know how Jimmy and Joe met, but next thing you know, Joe was in the band. I remember going to hear the band. I remember walking in and they were doing Baby You Can Drive My Car by the Beatles, and the guitar part was perfect. Sounded just like the record. And I said, who the hell is this guy? And it was Joe. And Joe always had the ability to do that. If it was Jeff Beck, sound like Jeff Beck. It was, he really had that sound. And then at that point, I was in LA for 5.5 years, and I had a whole other band called Uncle Tom in LA and whatever. And then, Jimmy continued. Then they recorded with ABC Dunhill. I think it was called Your Album, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
And then Rides Again.
And then Rides Again.
And then James Gang Thirds.
Right. Which was really the album, I think, that solidified them, and they did a tour in England with the Who, and Townshend came out every night. They opened up for the Who, and he came out on stage and said, "This is my favorite American band." And he loved Joe. So that was a big boost for them, because to have somebody like the Who give you that stamp of approval, and I think they did about, I don't know if it was a dozen or a dozen and a half dates with the Who in Europe. And that helped them a lot.
So from when Glenn was in the band, was it the James Gang?
Yeah.
So my assumption with all this is that Jim had a little bit of an entrepreneurial edge.
Yeah, Jim was the leader of the band.
And the James Gang means Jim Fox.
There's discussion on that. Yeah, a lot of people felt it was James Gang, but there was also, the James Gang, Jesse James and the James Gang. So
right.
And there's a bit of the cowboy shooting from the hip kind of vibe, and Jimmy's name, him being the leader of the band, which he was, that I'm sure that played a part in it. I don't know exactly.
Well, it's a double meaning at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I always assumed, and this is all assumption, that it was, as the leader of the band, it was kind of his band.
Yes, you're right.
And so from a business point of view, and I had no idea how that all worked, but anyway. So you said you moved to LA too, because of course moving to LA meant trying to get closer to the heart and soul of the record industry, which was LA.
And Dale and I moved to LA. We moved with that band E.T. Hooley I told you about.
Right.
And we got signed to a company called Far Out Productions, who had War, the band War. And we had a band called Uncle Tom. We had 2 black guys in the band, and the people that managed us, they liked the name War. Everybody was going peace, and they had a band called War. Now we had a band with 2 black guys. Are you saying these guys are Uncle Toms? No, they're not Uncle Toms, but we as a band are Uncle Tom. It was just to stir things up.
So was Dale in Uncle Tom?
No. Dale, E.T. Hooley we got a gig back in Cleveland, and I remember telling the band, if we go back, you guys are all going to stay there. Well, I had a lady living with me that became my wife, so I moved back to LA. Dale stayed in Cleveland, and Jimmy got Dale to join the James Gang.
And so was he the drummer in the band? When did he pick up the bass? When did he start being the bass player?
He took up the bass kind of when he went back to Cleveland after the Governors, where he played. I told you he played drums in the Governors. Then he went up to Cleveland. I was still going to school at Ohio State. He picked up the bass, and when he called me and said, "Let's form this band," and he said, "We'll need to get a drummer." I go, "But you're a drummer." He goes, "No, I play bass now." So that's how that went down. And then I was in LA for 5.5 years. We were on United Artists, this band Uncle Tom, And
I remember that's what War was on also, I believe.
right. And we did an album in Muscle Shoals, Alabama with Rick Hall. I'll tell you a funny story. When we first went down there, he came to LA and heard us. And he saw us as being more R&B. We were like a rock band that did R&B too. And when you walk into Fame Recording, you go up the steps, you walk down a long hallway, and on both sides of the hallway are gold records. Land of a Thousand Dances, Wilson Pickett, this guy, Clarence, Frogman Henry, by the time you get to his office, we were all about 4 inches high. We were little punks who had done nothing. And now here's Rick Hall sitting there, chewing on a piece of gum. And we're like in complete awe. The guy had, 25 gold records up there. We were nobody. He was actually involved with Tom Dowd in doing the first Aretha stuff.
Right, from Atlantic, not the Columbia stuff, but when he signed, because that's in the Aretha movie, going down there, and Aretha just vibed with those guys.
And those guys became a very famous rhythm section down there. Spooner Oldham and Roger Hawkins. And actually, Dwayne Allman was there for a little bit doing sessions with them. And I remember them telling me a story that Rod Stewart showed up with that artichoke haircut of his. And all the hillbilly players, they kind of made fun of him or something until he started singing. Then they all went, oh, a British guy with soul.
So you did that album. What was that? Uncle Tom did an album.
Did an album just called Uncle Tom. I don't know that it ever got released. They released a single called Flat Black, but I don't think they ever released the album. And,
you would remember that, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I don't think it ever got released. And but we played around. We continued to play around LA. We played regularly at the Starwood and so we played some really cool gigs and everything.
Well, we did a deep dive and we found 3 of the tracks from the Uncle Tom recordings.
Living life is like running a race.
So the album never came out. You guys did a full album.
Right.
Do you have any recollection of, because you guys must have been, everybody was ambitious, and everybody, if you saw progress being made, people would be excited. And you guys must have been pretty dialed in, going, wow, look at this. It's all coming together.
Yeah, we were, and we figured, hey, we're with a producer that's got a stone, not in rock really, but in R&B and in, I think he did Paul Anka, and he did
lots of people.
Right. So we were hoping that this was going to be the big thing, but it wasn't. And we continued to play, and we toured. And like I said, we came to Denver and Boulder and played. We played down in Texas and stuff like that. Played locally in LA. And then I got a call from Fox. Do you want to come and audition for the James Gang?
So did you guys, like you said, you would be, if you ever cross paths, you would go to the show. Joe would invite you after he was in Barnstorm to come by, whatever. So how dialed in were you to when Joe left the James Gang to where Jim must have been, you know, oh my God, we gotta, because there was momentum,
Oh yeah,
tremendous momentum.
yeah,
And
and
I'm sure his attitude would have been, how we got to keep this going.
right. And they got Don Troiano.
And
Then they got
Roy Kenner to sing.
Roy Kenner to sing because they had a band together called Bush, not the heavy metal Bush, a different Bush.
Right. And then they had a group before that called Mandela, I think.
Right.
They had a
Right.
song called Love Itis in the late
Yep, I
60s.
remember it well.
I bought that single.
Yeah, it was a cool record. I liked
It
that record.
was. Love
Yeah.
Itis got a hold on me that Joe had been replaced by Don Troiano and Roy Kenner. They did 2 albums, right? I believe in
Yeah, I think so.
Great Shooter was one of them. And I was working at the hip record store up in Boulder back then, and I just remembered that they didn't sell. And back in the day, anything that didn't sell got wholesaled out to cutout distributors, where they would punch a hole in the cover and sell it for 10 cents or whatever. And you would then buy those albums to sell for 99 cents or whatever. Basically, that's from a business end of what happened. And so that's when he called Joe and said, it's not working. And I guess, and I know Jim's story, I've heard him talk about, that Dom wasn't really passionate about being a rock star on stage kind of thing. And that's part of the story he tells.
Yeah, he was a terrific guitar player, but they were coming from different places.
Right. And so were you aware, were you dialed in enough about when Joe left and what happened, that they were carrying on with Dom and with Roy? Was that something you were aware
because
of?
I had met Dom in LA with his band Bush, with these guys I just talked with, Kenner and with, I think Kenner was in the band, but Whitey, Glenn, and Prakash. And they were, we liked them. We went to some club and saw him a couple times. And, next thing I know, he was in the James Gang, but it really wasn't a good fit philosophically, musically. They were, Donnie was more of a jazzy R&B kind of guy, chordal thing. And, he was miles different than Joe, miles different. And I wasn't surprised, having nothing to do with his ability, because like I say, Don was doing soundtracks for stuff in movies and stuff. I mean, it wasn't a good fit. Just like Paul Rodgers wasn't a good fit to be the lead singer in Queen when they tried that out. Paul Rodgers is a great rock singer, but he wasn't right to fill in for Freddie Mercury. It was a different thing. So anyway.
And who's not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Paul Rodgers.
Which is ridiculous.
That is at the top of the list of ridiculous.
Yeah, because when you think about those English soul singers, you think of him, Rod Stewart, Joe Cocker.
And Free was obviously amazing. And then when Bad Company came together, they were more wanting to then be a hit band.
Oh, yeah. Everything was geared in a hit.
And they were a hit band. Now they've let all the other bands that came later who had that kind of thinking in, like Journey and ELO, and there's a lot of them. But somehow Paul, Bad Company, it's all beyond me how that works.
They'll probably get in eventually. They run out of things. I don't know. It took Aretha Franklin a long time to get in. Think about that. Come on.
We could digress onto that subject for quite a while. So you said the next time you heard that Dom was in the James Gang, and so they did what they did over, I think, what had been a year and a half period. And this is where I do want to talk to Jim. So I think this would be fascinating to do this with Jim, because this is part of the whole thing here, is to how do we really take a close look at all the little corners of the Tommy Bolin path,
Yeah.
and how did everything lead up to whatever, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so then that didn't work out. And when were you cognizant of that this other guy, Tommy Bolin, had now joined the James Gang?
I think I just heard about it. I don't even really remember. Next thing I know, they had gotten Tommy. I think, well, Joe turned him on to Tommy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I think as soon as he got there, he's a hot guitar player. They were looking for a hot guitar player, and they found one.
And not only was a hot guitar player, he wrote, and wrote. He was a great composer. And so he
Right.
had endless melodic ideas. And
they
and that was
needed that because Jimmy and Dale didn't write anything.
and that was part of my connection with Tommy. He approached me and said, I want to buy a sound on sound reel to reel deck. I don't have any credit. Could you co-sign for me? And I did, and then he started recording acoustic demos where he could then overlay another guitar part, vocal part. And I judged that was the deck where he recorded a lot of the songs that became songs on James Gang Bang.
Yeah.
He was prolific. He was much more than he was a true, brilliant, genius grade guy who could play anything. He could write all day long. And it's the same thing happened in Deep Purple, of course. They had written a lot of their songs in a collective atmosphere. When Tommy got into Deep Purple, I mean, he didn't write the lyrics, but he wrote most of the music for the songs on Come Taste the Band. And he always had songs.
And did he replace Richie Blackmore?
Yeah, Blackmore quit, left him high and dry, because they had ascended to where they were on a similar level to the Stones and Led Zeppelin at that point, in terms of being able to tour all over the world. They were the top 3 touring rock bands back in the early 70s.
Huh.
And Richie, for whatever reason, and I always thought it must have had something to do with business, but that's never been really revealed. He's just like, no, I'm out. And their management had booking agents all over the world saying, hey, we got another tour for you. And so Glenn and Coverdale, they were the ones inside going, let's keep it going. Let's keep it going.
I remember watching Richie Black. We played a gig in Cleveland where we opened up. I forget what was the name of his band. Not Deep Purple. He had
Rainbow.
We watched him comb his hair for a half an hour. It was an old E.T. Hooley story. We were sitting there backstage, and he was messing with his hair. It just went on and on and on. We're a bunch of Cleveland guys, and he's up doing his due. It was just hysterical.
So anyway, Tommy comes in and does James Gang Bang, which, again, for people who are into Tommy and people who have objective ears who would listen to that album, it's really a great mainstream rock album that's done through that James Gang kind of container,
right?
Which Jim and Dale obviously were. A band gets established, and the goal obviously was to try to keep the James Gang sound going,
which is a problem. Because it's always a problem because a sound gets defined by the people in it. And if a singer has a certain voice and the guitar player has a certain style, and just like we said about Triano, terrific guitar player, but 150 miles away from what they were doing. And I don't think that Jimmy and Dale are, while very good rock players, they didn't have the thing to go soaring off the way Tommy did on guitar, whereas he could get together with a Billy Cobham or who was that guy?
Alphonse Mouzon.
Right. They could take that and go with it. That wasn't Jimmy and Dale's bag at all.
But famously, they did Stratus on tour.
Yeah.
And those recordings, which are not a lot, and they're kind of audience recordings, they sound pretty good. You know, they're it's not
They
like
can learn
they're
stuff and they can go, I mean, it's it's a, it's a delicate balance.
so they did the Bang album, and then they immediately started touring quite a bit. And the album, unfortunately, didn't really get the kind of airplay that the Joe Walsh albums had gotten. And they obviously were reinvigorated compared to the albums that Dom was on, but it never really caught fire as such. And Tommy, as we were talking before, was really as we got into 1974, which was when they did the Miami album in Miami with Tom Dowd producing. Um, he was already had one foot out the door. I believe he was also Tommy had his path of substance usage, which there's reasons why he was susceptible to going that way. And now in modern psychological science, a lot of times it's tied to early childhood trauma that propels people to have such an addictive pattern. And so Tommy was propelled as he got more and more exposure, more and more money, more and more touring. He couldn't control the part of him that was basically running away from himself. And back in those days, there was so much romance tied up in getting loaded. There was no Betty Ford clinic. Um, and people didn't have a sense of anything other than whatever they were doing. And so I think that became part of what was going on. I know I've heard some reference to that in terms of how the James Gang, whatever chemistry they wound up establishing, that started interfering with the interpersonal
Yeah,
chemistry.
Tommy was a bit off the hook. I mean, I remember gigs where they would, let's say they're playing Chicago and they're going to fly to Atlanta. I think I told you this the last time we spoke. And Tommy would stop in New York on the way down to Atlanta. He'd show up the next morning, because he had to pick up some blow or whatever.
We go back, and whatever the point was where Tommy then officially was not in the James Gang anymore. And that's when you would have been, and that's when I want to go to that point right now. What do you remember then in terms of
Well,
Jim
Bubba Keith
reaching out
and
to you?
I, from the Uncle Tom, we flew to Cleveland. We played with him for an afternoon or something. We went back to LA. They said, okay, come on back to Cleveland. So I don't know how long it took us, some weeks or whatever. I remember my conga player and Uncle Tom wanted to beat me up because I was leaving Uncle Tom, because we were like a family. We partied together. We did everything together. So
So
moved to Cleveland.
Bubba was part of Uncle Tom from the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah, and he and I wrote the songs for Uncle Tom.
Yep.
So Jimmy figured, okay, you guys can come, you can write some songs, and he'll be the singer and I'll be the guitar player. So we did that. We came to Cleveland. We recorded. Tom Dowd came into Cleveland. I'll never forget. I picked Tom Dowd up from the airport. It's Tom fucking Dowd. It's Tom Dowd.
Yep.
And it was a miserable Cleveland day. Sleet and ice and ugly. And I'll never forget, as we're driving to I guess there was studio probably, or maybe his hotel, I don't remember. He goes, "What do you do in this town?" Because he was a guy who, when he wasn't in the studio, he'd be golfing or he'd be bicycling. He lived down in Miami somewhere in Florida.
Yeah, I think probably Miami, because he was recording at Criteria down there all the time.
So, and then we recorded an album in Cleveland with Tom.
So in terms of that repertoire, do you remember, were you guys developing the songs before Tom came down? Were you doing rehearsals? And were you trying to get an album's worth of material prepared before Tom came in?
And Bubba and I had written some songs And, I play them for Jimmy and Dale. Well, this is kind of more rock. Let's try this one. And that one, that's more for your Uncle Tom. Kind of, we tried to figure out what would work and what wouldn't. And yeah, we rehearsed and we got some songs together. And then when Tom came in, Tom was like a combination of I used to call him the soul scientist. Technically, he was very adept, but he was also a very soulful guy, and he could tell an artist or a band, you did your best stuff. You keep wanting to do it over and over. I'm going to play you something you did 3 hours ago that are better than what you're doing now.
You picked Tom up at the airport. You go, this is Tom fucking Dowd.
Yeah.
So do you remember the playbacks or at the point you guys felt the album was done? Do you have a memory of sitting in the studio as a band listening to what you guys had done?
Yeah. And, sometimes when you're recording and you're hearing this stuff for hours and hours, day after day, you sort of lose your sense of what's good and what's not good. And I think this is better. Well, I think that's better.
We're going to wrap up part 1 of our oral history with Richard Shack by listening to the first track from the James Gang Newborn album, the album they did with Tom Dowd, first album after James Gang Miami. Plus, in part 2, we'll hear more of the Newborn album, and we'll get Richard's point of view about what happened with the album once it came out and his time touring with the James Gang. Then, we will explore the night Tommy Bolin played at the Agora Theater in Cleveland, and Richard's next band, Jump, opened for Tommy, and Richard's perspective on Tommy both before and after the show. Stay tuned for part 2. And now, here's Merry Go Round from the James Gang, Newborn, with Richard Shack and Bubba Keith.